Hi guys, welcome back. Nick Thomas here at the Academy of Historical Fencing. Today's going to be all about the Spadroon, which is a sword that does not get much love within the sword community. Maybe from collectors to a certain degree, but certainly from those that use or practice with swords, they don't get any love, really, at all. But it is really, really important to the history of British swordsmanship. So I'm going to be talking about what it is, where it came from, what came after it, what people thought of it, and I would say I'm in a good position to talk about it because I collect them. I've got 4 complete Spadroons and a bare blade as well, which I'm looking for parts for, so I have 4.5 original Spadroons. I do a lot of research on how we actually use these swords, because when you train from something like Angelo or Roath, you're training a system that was designed for Spadroon, saber and broadsword. That is the Infantry saber, the Scottish broadsword and the Spadroon. So I collect them, I train for the system, and I also research the actual sort of historical accounts of weapons being used, which there are relatively few of, but enough of that you can get an idea from, particularly if you look at books like Kingsley's British Swordsman and things like that. I'll put some links into that. That's really, really useful. Loads and loads of accounts of historical combat with swords. Anyway, what is the Spadroon? When I'm going to talk about the Spadroon, of course, I'm largely talking about it in this type, the regulation Napoleonic era sword. But the term Spadroon goes back a little bit further, and despite the fact that you get some massive hatred for this pattern Spadroon, some of the perspectives on it earlier on in the 18th century were rather different. So when you get to the Napoleonic period, this exact sword was often ridiculed as things like, it was called things like the regulation spit, or another officer, for example, referred to it as the perfect encumbrance. So you get some really sort of derogatory sort of terms being used for it, and you can kind of understand why when I go more into it. And yet, when you go back to the earlier 18th century, you'll get things from fencing masters and instructors like Donald MacBain, who said it was an extraordinary weapon that none can compare with, which is rather positive. And Archibald MacGregor said the master of all swords. So something's not tying up there. You got early to mid 18th century, the Spadroon's great. Get to the regulation, later stuff, and it's terrible. Now clearly the difference there is that back in MacBain's and MacGregor's time, there wasn't a regulation British pattern Spadroon, so it could refer to a variety of different swords. And you get the sense, well in fact they do say it's the weapon that European armies equip themselves with. And if you look at swords that kind of resemble this, that the European armies were using around about 1700 up to about 1750, they do look a bit like this. They're quite similar, that they have kind of shell protections here, they have a knuckle bow, they're straight, they're roughly similar. But if you look at the actual specification of them, those European variants are much more substantial, and I think that's the key difference here, is that a Napoleonic Spadroon like this usually weighs around about 700 grams, whereas the European earlier 18th century stuff tended to be about 1.1 kilos. And I think that's why people like MacBain and MacGregor really liked them, is that compared to their Scottish basket hilts, which were often 1.3 to 1.5 kilos, they're going to have something with as much reach, much better point control, still a strong cutter, still with a fair bit of protection, so it would come across as a lighter, more agile Scottish broadsword that can compete more with some lighter swords and just be a bit more useful, just because it's not quite so heavy, and still able to cut and thrust really effectively. So I'm not saying they were wrong when you go back to the earlier 18th century stuff, it's just a different sword, and that's when you see the Spadroon coming in. Also they call it the shearing sword, and that's when the term sort of starts to come into use. Right, sorry, bit bunged up. So let's look at what sort of, and I'll give a bit of an introduction, let's look at what led up to the Spadroon, because it didn't just appear from nowhere. If you go back to what came before it, which is kind of really, really important, because the end of the 18th century was the sort of standardisation and regulation of a lot of weapons within the British Army. Before then, there was not the standardisation. In fact, one of the first things that was standardised in the British Armed Forces was the musket, and I think the Brown Bess, for example, which is iconic, and that was one of the things that was standardised really, really early. And of course the red coat. But in terms of swords, there were all kinds of oddities. Some of the colonels of the regiment would stipulate equipment that they wanted to use, which was very common. They could just choose regimentally. Others, officers especially, could just use whatever they wanted. And also, the officers throughout most of the 18th century were commonly using some kind of polearm called a spontoon or halberd, pike, spear, half pike. It had quite a few different terms. Certainly by the Napoleonics it was normally called a spontoon, which leads to some confusion because you've got Spadroon, which is a small sword, not literally a small sword, but a smallish sword, and a spontoon, which is a half pike or spear or partisan, 7 to 9 foot sort of polearm, and that's a little bit confusing. But anyway, that's the terminology for you. And up until around about the 1860s, 1870s, polearms were standard for officers, and they were ordered to drop them and just carry swords. And then the polearms only carried on for sergeants after that. Famously, if you watch the Sharp series, the character Hakeswell carries a spontoon, and you can see it there. So, essentially, one of the things that was carried, because there was massive variety, was the small sword. Now, a small sword in profile looks much like a Spadroon. It has the shell guards. It has roughly, particularly this Kalichimard blade, which is this triangular section blade that tapers broadly towards the fort. It looks in profile like a Spadroon, but it's a triangular section blade that has no cutting edges. It's a lot lighter, usually 400 to 500 grams. As I said, no cutability, but excellent on the thrust and much better point control, and much stiffer because of this triangular construction. So, although we think of this as a civilian sword, and it is a civilian sword, they were also carried by officers of the army in the earlier parts of the 18th century. It wasn't a good sword for officers to carry, but they did. It was fashionable. They knew how to use them, at least because they did practice small sword, a lot of them, and they had a polearm as well, so it could largely be seen as a sort of a badge of honour or something like that. So yeah, they did carry small swords to some degree. Various British officers also carried basket hilts, like you think of like you think the Scottish officers carried big basket hilts. English officers commonly carried those throughout the 18th century as well. And on top of that, sabers. People assume that, I hear it all the time, that the saber was just adopted because the infantry wanted to copy the cavalry. And that's just nonsense. I mean, you can kind of see why they think it, because in the Napoleonic period, officers started going from Spadroons to sabers, and you think, oh, it's just copying the cavalry. But that's nonsense, because the saber and various curved blades were used by infantry officers all the way through the 18th century, and actually going back into the 17th century. So, this is a English officer's saber or hanger. It's right at that size where it's in between hanger and saber. So what you want to call it, it doesn't really matter, but it could be either. This is a project I'm working on. It needs a good bit of cleanup, but you can see it anyway. This is an absolutely typical, iconic sort of infantry officer's sword of the American Revolutionary period. So a nice bit before regulation patterns were adopted. And you can see it has a slotted hilt, like the 1803 pattern sword that I've shown you before. So the slotted hilt wasn't new in the Napoleonic period. It had been in for a good few decades. And this one would have had additional side protection bars here, reminiscent, I suppose, of some of the Gothic hilt swords of the 19th century. But there you go. That is an English hanger, officer's hanger or sabre of the around about 1870s period. And you'd see something like this initially appearing around about 1860, maybe even 1850. So many of these kind of swords appeared in the 18th century. They're the kind of things that you think of as a pirate sword. And yes, pirates would have used them because they're a common short sword in use at the time. Curvature varies. This one is kind of medium curve, if you like to medium. But you can find them in all different forms. And the thing that is characteristic of hangers and sabres of this period is that they have a pommel, which means they look a bit more like a Spadroon in the hilt, if you like, than a lot of Napoleonic sabres do that just have a back strap. That doesn't change much at all, to be honest. If you were trying to use this kind of grip, maybe it does, but the Spadroon was used with this grip as well. So anyway, you can see the sabre and cutlass and hangers and things like that, because hanger and cutlass are the same weapon category. Yes, they were commonly used curved blades like this, but in 1786, a new regulation came in. It was an actual order to the army for officers to adopt a new regulation pattern, the first ever pattern introduced to the British in a widespread way. And that was 1786. in fact, it was not a sword pattern, but a blade pattern. This is a bare blade I've got. It's had a thread welded on it. That wouldn't have been on there originally, it would have been peened. But anyway, this here is a regulation blade. This would have come off either a 1786 pattern or a 1796 pattern, which had exactly the same types of blade. The regulation stipulated that the officers had to have a straight blade that was at least 1 inch wide at the fort and 32 inches long and good for cut and thrust. And that's all they stipulated. And also the colour of the hilt, sorry. They said that the hilt had to match the buttons of the uniform, so, you know, silver or sort of black and steel or gilt, something like that, so gold. But not a blade, not a hilt pattern. So you could find massive variety in the way the hilts here look. They could look like a saber guard, they could look like that American Revolutionary War period slotted hilt. They could have shells, they could have all kinds. But anyway, you can see that there is typical of a 1786 or 1796 blade that was introduced. So yeah, they introduced this regulation straight blade. But they did not say whether it should be single or double-edged, whether it should be fulled or not. They didn't specify any kind of weight, and even though they said about width at the fort, they didn't say anything about the rest of the blade. So you could have it 1 inch here and a few millimetres at the tip. So the 1786 pattern is incredibly loose. Even though it was the first introduction of a pattern for British swords, it's a very, very loose pattern. And here's an example of how loose it can be. This was either made as a 1786 pattern or just so happened to fit the regulations before it. Chances are it was made as a 1786 regulation pattern. And you do see a fair amount of them, like this one. This is actually double-edged. In fact, this looks like a rapier blade more than anything. And it handles more like a rapier blade for that matter as well. Tapers quite nicely to the tip, good point control, much more rigid than the fulled single-edged blades. And then the hilt, you can see, is a typical sort of D-guard or stirrup hilt. So this is kind of really typical of a Spadroon that came in 1786, and it's incredibly light. This one is 560 grams, and that means it's only a little bit heavier than some of the small swords I've got. Most of my small swords are in 400 to 500 gram range. My heaviest, which is an edged small sword, is 510 grams, and this is only 560. So you can see it's close to some small swords. But if you handled it, you'd notice that it has some cutting capabilities, and it's a lot more rigid than some of the fulled Spadroons I've got. So in fact, I would say this is a better weapon. It's also got a better grip shape, and you can actually thumb the back, which is common for a Spadroon. And this one is actually marked up, so this is most definitely marked up with a GR crown and everything else. This is a British Spadroon, and yeah, the 1786 pattern. Very, very light, and as I said, this is one typical sort of shape of hilt, if you like. You can get all different kinds of pommels and guards and shells or not, and slotted hilts, so they vary immensely. So that was 1786. Then in 1796, they finally introduced an actual guard pattern, which stipulated 2 shells and a gilt guard and a wire, silver wire grip. And the blades stayed exactly the same in terms of regulation. And you then see they almost always then have this fulled single-edged blade. Not always, I have seen double-edged examples on this hilt, but they usually are. And this is actually one of the heaviest examples I've seen. The hilt is much larger. For example, this is another example I have of the same pattern, and it is, the shells, as you can see, are a hell of a lot smaller. This also has the fold-in shell guard, which that wasn't to do with regulation at all. Just some manufacturers made it that way and some officers preferred it that way because it actually sits flush on your uniform and it doesn't rub. So it's a bit smarter and doesn't rub the jacket. Yeah, so you can see this one is 700 grams, this one's 750. So this one with the fixed guards is one of the most substantial of the patterns I've ever seen. Now, what was it like as a sword? Now this is the one that has had loads of ridicule that I read about on my screen just there. And yes, there's some comments there, for example, at the time that it couldn't parry against a saber, and it just had constant ridicule. There was a few other terms for it. Yeah, I told you about the perfect encumbrance. That's what I can remember for now. Anyway, you get the idea of why it was such a bad sword when you take a look at the blade and realise that it doesn't have much cutting power. It's very fine at the tip, and the hilt is quite heavy for its blade, and that brings the balance a long way back. In fact, they usually balance at just around about 8 centimetres or something like that, which is really far back. Most sabres are in the 10 to 15 range, and they can go a bit more, but most infantry sabres are 10 to 15. So back at 8 centimetres, and with a narrow tip, it has quite poor cutting ability. And in terms of the thrust, they are really, really flexible, which is why quite a lot of the accounts say they're not good at cut or thrust, because the trouble is, if it has that much flexibility, it's often not going to have enough rigidity to drive into a target. So not good at the thrust and not good at the cut. The guards are a little bit more substantial than some of the sabres at the time, so you've got a bit more protection, but they're so weak, and particularly if you look at these folding guards ones, loads of them are broken here because the hinges in the section here are so weak. The shells themselves are normally quite thin. It doesn't offer much protection, really, and the grip shape is quite frankly horrid. The Spadroon at the time was described as using a thumbs up or thumb on the backstrap if you had a sabre grip, which is common when you go to 19th century sabres. So what he's talking about is holding it like this, or the thumb rotated slightly around. And to be honest, the grip shape is terrible for that. It's better suited to a hammer grip, but then you don't want to use it with a hammer grip because you want more point control and more thrust work. So it's not well suited at all. Now, why did they go with this? Well, we will never fully know, but I think the likelihood is that gentlemen, most officers at the time were gentlemen. It wasn't that common until you actually get into the Napoleonic Wars to raise officers up through the ranks. So pretty much all your officers were gentlemen, and pretty much all gentlemen trained with fencing. So they'd be using foils and small swords. So they'd be used to using something that resembled that small sword. And if you give them this, they can fence like a small sword and just add a few cutting techniques in. And I think that is largely the reason it was done. People say that an officer can be given a sword like this because he's not expected to ever use it. Well, that is utter bullshit. If you look at that time period, the 18th century, officers were expected to lead from the front. And as a result, officers tended to either get shot on the way in or get into hand-to-hand combat themselves. So it was incredibly common for British officers at the time to get into hand-to-hand combat. And I don't just mean the light infantry and the riflemen and fusiliers and stuff like that, but the ones that would expect to be at the front. I mean all officers of all ranks. And you read accounts of things like the siege of Badajoz, and you've got colonels at the front of the siege going in there with their sword. So yes, British officers at the time really were expected to be leading from the front, and they would commonly get into hand-to-hand combat. So yes, they would have to use this sword in anger. And if you look at Kingsley's book, there are a couple of accounts of it being used, and it's described in how dire and awful it is as a regulation sword. And yet there is one account of a guy, an officer, defended himself against 5 attackers, and eventually he gets stabbed with a spear and then fights them off when somebody else gets involved. So he managed with it. And there is actually one more account of an officer cleaving somebody's head almost clean off, and just leaving a little bit of skin left where the head's come off, and supposedly with the regulation sword, this. Now, it's a reasonably good length sword. If it was nicely sharpened and you cut really effectively with it, yeah, maybe it's possible. But it has so many other issues, is that you're going to have to cut very well, very accurately. It's not very robust, the thrust isn't very good. So could you survive in a fight like this, using this against other swords? Yes, you could. You could make it work if you knew what you were doing and you're reasonably good. That doesn't make it a good sword. I mean, you could defend yourself with a stick against a sword. It doesn't mean it's the best weapon for the scenario. It quite frankly is a dreadful sword. The hilt is too heavy for the type of blade. The blade isn't suited to thrust or cut. It's not very strong. It's just not very good. It's not very robust. It's just not very good in any way. The trouble is it's too much of a compromise. The small sword, for example, doesn't compromise much at all. Yes, it loses the cut, but it just emphasises that thrust, and it goes after good thrust and ability. So it's rigid, it's light, it's strong. The guard is well suited to thrust work, so it doesn't compromise in what it wants to do. And the Spadroon does. Not good at anything. So, is the Spadroon a piece of junk? Yes. Can you just about survive with it? Yes, you can. Would you ever want to have to use this? No. It is an awful sword. And I say an awful sword when I talk about Spadroons because I'm talking about the British regulation Spadroon. Now, if you want to talk about what was called the Spadroon in the early 18th century, for example, that's a slightly different story. Were they all bad? Well, I do have one more Spadroon, which is this. This is a French pattern Spadroon from, I believe, 1823, I think it is. So just after the Napoleonic period, although there were lots like this in use around about the time of the Napoleonic Wars. And it is a better sword. I hate to say it, because it's French. I hate to say that it's a better sword, but it is. And the reason it's a better sword is because, like my early Spadroon, the 1786, it is double-edged and made with this central ridge section. You see it's actually hollow ground, which as a result, it's really rigid, very strong, and quite light for its size as well. So it's heavier than my others. It's 100 grams heavier than some of my other Spadroons. And I think this one, as a result, is going back a little bit towards what McGregor and McBain were talking about. It's just something a little bit more substantial. I think they were talking about something a bit beefier again. But even so, the brass guard of this, the folding mechanism, it's all strong, robust. The grip is still not brilliantly shaped, but in every way, this is a better sword than all of the other British Spadroons that I've got. Does that make it a good sword? I wouldn't say so. It's a better sword, but it's still just not particularly good. To make this sword better, you need a better grip shape, and I'd ideally want a little bit more mass up here for cutting power as well. So, is the Spadroon a piece of junk? Yes, it is. I would never ever want to have to depend on it or use it to defend my life. That's just insanity. And to look at what happened with it, because it came in, as I said, the kind of proper one we know with the proper hilt and the regulation one, the 1796, that's when it became standard. By 1799, a new order was put out that light infantry and fusiliers, grenadiers and mits could already use a sabre. They didn't stipulate a pattern, but they could use a sabre because the army noticed that some infantry officers already were using sabres. So that's just 3 years after the regulation was brought in. By 1803, they realised that they had to do something more than that, and they brought in a new regulation of infantry officer's sword, this is the one I bring out all the time. I've got 2 of this pattern, but this is the first one I bought. This is an 1803 infantry officer's sword. It's sometimes called a flank officer's sword. Flank officers, the way it works is you have your line infantry, your line companies in the centre, which officers would have Spadroons, and on the flanks you have light infantry and grenadiers. So therefore those are the flanks, light infantry, grenadiers. Light infantry and grenadiers therefore are your flank officers, or the officers in those companies are your flank officers, and they were permitted to carry this sword. Also then when the rifle companies started, they were allowed to carry it as well. Certain foot guards and things like that were allowed to carry them, and staff officers. And if you look at accounts of the time, you'll see that quite a lot of other regiments started adopting them anyway, even though they were line company. So it became a really, really popular sword with any officer who wanted a good fighting sword or would expect to actually end up in combat. And it is a better sword in every way. It is based on the 1796 light cavalry. It's just made slightly lighter, slightly shorter, and it has massive cutting ability, whilst having a hilt that still has a reasonable amount of protection. It's a nice slotted hilt. And although this was an excellent fighting sword, it never fully replaced the Spadroon. That didn't happen until 1821, when a new regulation was brought in that replaced both the 1803 sabre and the old Spadroon. And I've got one here. This is actually a rifle version. So in 1821, they introduced this Gothic hilt. Now this is steel because this is a rifle officer's. The regulation, the normal infantry ones were brass, like you saw my other hilt there. And this is a fulled example, so it's post 1845. The initial ones were pipe back, which I've shown on a few other videos. But this is the fulled example, typical 19th century infantry sabre. And if you look, it kind of combines the Spadroon and the 1803 sabre together, in that the curvature is in between. It's lightly curved as opposed to the extreme curve of the 1803. It has a broader blade at the tip than the Spadroon, a lot broader, but nowhere near as broad as an 1803. It has the full length of the Spadroon though, and it has the protection of a Spadroon. So you can see what kind of happened is that when this new Gothic hilt was brought in, they combined the best elements of the two swords and made something in between. And what they ended up with is a sword that doesn't cut quite as well as the 1803 pattern, but still cuts pretty damn well. It is still a good cutter, as good as many swords throughout history, plenty good enough for the job, but with much better point control, a little bit extra reach, better hand protection. So overall they ended up with a really good sword. And when you see me fencing with kind of a ball-hilted sabre, that's what I'm representing as this, something a bit longer with less curvature than my Napoleonic stuff. And I love both the swords. I think in many ways, if I had to go in to most combats, I think this would probably be a better sword than the 1803 for some actions. I think the 1803 has the advantage in that it's got a bit more mass to the blade. It's a bit shorter, so it's better suited to some closer range actions, and the cutting power is just that little bit stronger. So to which sword is necessarily better, I think you'd be hard pressed to say. I think the 1803 in some close-up brawling and stuff like that might be a better sword, and if you had a little bit more distance and you were fighting more one-on-one stuff, I think these Gothic hilt swords are better, but I think it's pretty minor the difference between the two. They're both good swords. Right, so just drop one of the swords, and going back to the Spadroon. 1786 initial introduction, 1796 they became this standardised form, absolutely hated sort of almost universally by so many of the sources that exist on it. It was a terrible sword. It got replaced unofficially and officially to a degree within just a few years, and completely replaced just after the Napoleonic period. Very few people in the HEMA scene, almost nobody, trains with this type of sword because it's almost universally hated. It doesn't look particularly good compared to the sabers that are out there or the small swords, and it's not a particularly good fighting sword. So that's what I'm going to say about it. Just because it's bad, it doesn't mean it's not important. I collect them and I research them, and I also do train with them because it is an important part of British sword history. These, after all, were the first regulation infantry officers' swords, also carried by sergeants for that matter. So they are really, really important to the history of British swordsmanship, while still being particularly bad. But I think what replaced them, the non-pattern, the 1803, and later the Gothic hilt swords, were really, very, very good. So anyway, that's an overview of the Spadroon. Yes, it is junk, but it's still kind of cool. I hope you enjoyed the video. Thanks for watching. If you have any questions, please post them in the comments section. And if you haven't subscribed, please do so.